Hey everybody, it's Pastor Siri. I'm a Lutheran pastor and a spiritual seeker, and one of the things I like to do is what I call spiritual archaeology, where I look back in time through wonderful, wonderful writings that people are doing as they're unearthing what the early church and what life would have been like before the story of patriarchy and church power kind of got a hold of our theology. So I love reading about books that sort of unearth and go back behind the scenes. And one of the books I just completed was When God Had a Wife. And if you haven't already, I have a wonderful video on the book When God Was a Woman, which touched me deeply. And this one also had a really big impact. So take a listen as I do my best to summarize. So I just want to say that the title probably freaks a lot of Christians out because, well, I'm just going to say it. We have been taught that there is one God, only one God. Any other God is not real. Any other God is fake. And that God is a man. I mean, basically throughout the Bible, all the pronouns are he. It's exhausting. And the odd part about that is even biblical references that are really like the imagery is very feminine of laboring and birthing and midwifing and nursing. The pronouns are still he. Figure that one out for me. So I was really interested in this book. It was actually given to me and I read it, and there's so much amazing detail in there. If you really want to know the details, please read it for yourself. I'm not going to go through a massive 1 hour long lecture on all of the details, but here is the wrap, the way I understand it. So basically, there is a lot of biblical footprints, lingering evidence that for most of Israel's history, until about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah after the Babylonian exile and return, there was not just worship of Yahweh, the male god, but there was also worship of the divine feminine in the form of Asherah. Now, I just want to caveat one thing, that through most of human history across culture, it has been normal to have both masculine and feminine versions of the divine. And I say versions of the divine because God is spirit. God is mystery. God is beyond human form. And yet having that sort of yin and yang balance between masculine and feminine imagery helps us psychically to be able to talk about all of the different images, imagery, energies, personalities, aspects of the human life being owned by the divine, having something to relate to. It's really powerful. And so When God Was a Woman, it talked about how there was a long history of goddess worship where the goddess was actually the one who was more powerful and she had a consort. They don't go into this in this book, okay? It's more of the idea that there were male and female pairs in like every religion. And it's not to say there were two gods. Maybe some people thought that. There's always people who take things really literally, but really that idea that what it does up here psychologically is then the divine is holding both masculine and feminine imagery and energy, okay? So there's also the idea that God sort of changed forms a little bit, that early on God is referred to as El, which any biblical scholar will tell you. And then as things moved on, it was pretty much Yahweh. And there's some really interesting history they talk about where God was like El was the main god and had all of these different like children, and Yahweh was one of those. And each of those children was designated a tribe. And the Israelites were Yahweh's tribe. And then Asherah came along with them and followed. And at some point, eventually, Yahweh became sort of the main God. And then around the time of Isaiah, there was this idea of, nope, it's the only God. There is no other God. And not only is there no other God, but there's no other half of God. The feminine aspect is done. We're just going to have the male aspect. Whenever in the Bible you have references to high places, you have references to the Asherim, you have references to fruit trees, to Deborah sitting under a palm tree. These are references to goddess worship. Goddess worship wasn't so much done in a temple as it would have been done out in nature. But even so, there were temples for goddesses all over the world with priestesses who were in charge. And there are evidence and talking about like Miriam as being a priestess and a prophetess, of Deborah being this powerful woman who was the judge of all of Israel. In 1 Samuel, in the very beginning, it talks about Eli's sons having done something, having sex with the women who were at the gates of the temple. What were they doing? Serving at the entrance of the temple. Why were they there? We just skim over all of these things and don't realize there might have been a whole nother reality that we are not aware of because it's been lost to time and possibly was edited out. And that's that idea that there may have been priestesses, holy women, who were honoring and keeping up the goddess worship alongside the Yahweh worship, that it was the masculine and the feminine together that were honored. There's also references, especially in the prophets, to cult prostitutes. And there's been a lot more work and research done on this, that this is really an unfair term, that really we're talking about priestesses for goddess worship who understood the sacredness of sexuality and may have used sexuality in a consensual way in which they had autonomy of their body and saw that union between bodies as being something very sacred and very holy. So a lot has shifted in erasing the aspects from the Bible so we don't even see it anymore, as well as in demonizing parts of the Bible that refer to the feminine worship. At the end of Solomon's life in 1 Kings, there's a reference to, him being this amazing king with great wisdom. But when he was old, all his wives kind of got him to worship the Asherah and got him to worship, the goddesses and other gods. And that was kind of his downfall. So there's this demonizing of the women taking this sweet, vulnerable, wise, old, amazing king and kind of ruining his legacy to some degree. But in this book, they continue to talk about how really Asherah worship was official alongside Yahweh, and no one saw any problem with it. Why? Because every other culture on the planet had a masculine and a feminine. They had those two divine energies, which would have been very, very psychologically helpful to keep things rounded and balanced. Masculine represents one kind of way of being in the world, and the feminine is another way of being in the world. And everything in between, right? It doesn't have to be a binary, but it's inclusive of all of the different energies. And the minute you start slicing half of that off, you diminish, demonize, and dismiss half of the human experience. And that's not just women, but it's how it shows up in men as well. So basically, this is what happened. There started to be some prophets like Hosea and Amos and Jeremiah who kind of were in the Yahweh only, like only Yahweh, forget Asherah. And this wasn't super popular, apparently. Didn't have any teeth, didn't have any lasting legs. And it wasn't until after the Babylonian exile and the return when Ezra and Nehemiah and a couple of those prophets in that time really started hammering. This all happened because we were not worshiping Yahweh only. And they took a lot of power and control in their hands to basically eliminate Asherah worship, to take all those little sweet figurines out of the home, relegate women out of any position of power in religion back to the home. And so the divine feminine really was erased and just kind of survived in the threads of being Sophia and the woman in Proverbs, still present, but far quieter, far more subtle ways, an aspect of God rather than being an equal energy with the masculine in the figure of God. Very different. In the second half of the book, she goes deeper into a lot of stuff I'd never heard about, which I'm not necessarily going to go into, about Simon the Magus and how he shows up in the book of Acts, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which is really cool. But I do want to talk about Mary Magdalene because she does show up in this book, and how her legacy, as we know, was tarnished. Her importance, that she must have been really, really important, because not only does she show up in all four Gospels, even if it's in a very small capacity, but there's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. She shows up in the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. There is a lot in the early writings of the church that clearly saw her as an important person. And in a lot of ways, she sort of disappeared from history and became just a repentant sinner rather than a spiritual powerhouse that she was. And this book sort of talks about how Mary Magdalene and Jesus really in the ministry together embodied that sort of masculine feminine back again, and that Jesus would not have had a male ego about that. He wouldn't have, like other people might have, he didn't see this as being a threat to his manhood, a threat to his ego. He was very happy to recognize beauty, power, and spiritual authority where it came in, and to work with that and to uplift it and empower and share all of that. And the sad thing is that Christianity was not actually based then on Jesus's egalitarian ways, which is all throughout the Gospels, but rather on a few verses in the letters of Paul that are easy to quote because you can just pull them out and throw them at a woman and tell her to shut up and sit down, rather than every single time Jesus encounters a woman in the Gospels, he is uplifting her. And in a culture where he, as a Jewish rabbi, would not have spoken to them, they would not have spoken to him, women were following Jesus. Women were speaking to Jesus. He was touching them and engaging with them and uplifting them, and never, ever did he tell them to sit down and be quiet. In fact, Mary of Bethany, one of my favorite characters, who may actually have been Mary Magdalene. It's an interesting conversation that's out there in the biblical world. When she sits at Jesus' feet, that is a way of saying that that's what disciples did. That's what male disciples did. They sat at the foot of their rabbi and they learned. If she's doing that and Jesus is encouraging that, it means she's acting like a male disciple. And Jesus is cool with that, because maybe she already was a disciple and Jesus was cool with that. There's so much to talk about here, but the implications of this are very fascinating. The implications of this is that there actually is, in the Judeo-Christian history, precedent for the divine feminine in a powerful way that isn't just scraps. And I'm going to be honest, I have felt like women have gotten scraps. Yes, there's cool women in the Bible. Yes, we have Sophia and Shekinah and the woman in Proverbs. My friends, it's not enough. It's not effing enough when you have an entire Bible that refers to God as he, right? And the Trinity has been taught as basically three dudes in the sky, and an entire 2,000 years or 1,700 years of church history is male dominated. It's not enough. And it is so cool to know that there was a precedent for that. The implications, though, of this having been cut off for us is evident in the power and the hierarchy and the control and the external authority of the church and the Bible and pastors and popes telling you what to do, that you can't trust your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own tuition, your own dreams, your own visions, your own connection to God, your own internal authority, which is a whole aspect of living as a human being that is so deeply important. Our ability to connect with the divine in our own way, and to be a full human being with all our emotions, all our feelings, honoring our sexuality and our emotions and our intuition and our thoughts, our connections with one another, our connections with earth. A lot of that has been severed. It's been diminished and even demonized, depending on who you talk to and where you go, which is incredibly sad, because we're literally taking that which is sacred and we've demonized it. That's pretty awful. It's really time that even if you don't love books like this, There's more and more and more of these are being written because more things are coming out. More of what has been suppressed is coming to the surface. And it's time for us to look at the damage that patriarchal religion has done to our planet and has done to our own psyche. And what would it be like for us to be able to embrace the fullness of both masculine and divine within ourselves, within each other, and within the divinity? So, gosh, I feel like there's so much we could continue to talk about here. If you have any questions or points of clarification that you want to know more of, say it in the comments. Like, what is your experience with patriarchal church? Like, has it worked for you? Is what I'm saying shaking up everything you've ever known? Is it a balm to your ears? Like, what's going on in your heart and in your spiritual journey? I shared a little bit about mine. We're all on a spiritual journey, folks, and God's trying to meet us where we're at. And I believe God is also far, far ahead of the game. She's waiting there for all of us. Okay, next time. Bye-bye.